A very, very warm welcome to you on this wonderful, warm, sunny day to spend inside a hotel room. My name is Michael Clark. I'm the director for ICT for D at the International Development Research Center. And I want to welcome you all here. There are a lot of friends that I haven't seen for a long time, a lot of colleagues, a lot of people I want to meet, and even a little element of family in here as well, so which is good. We are about to do an experiment in the light of the fact that IDRC is a research organization, and we like to think that we deal with innovation and experimentation. We are trying to probe the edges of an idea. And that idea is, having worked in the field of information and communications technologies for development at IDRC, a program that's been long-standing and indeed I think has been precedent-setting in many ways. And we actually like to think it actually built the field of inquiry around ICT for D. We are looking at the next stage of the evolution of this field of inquiry and this field of research. And we've been asking ourselves some pretty serious and deep questions about where this is all going to go. And we decided that we couldn't answer the questions. So that's why we brought you here to help us answer those questions and to conduct a real experiment in pushing the whole notion of how information and communications technologies for development actually play a role in the process of development. So this idea of ours sits very well entrenched between the world of development assistance, the development of research for development, and the role that information and communications technologies plays in that whole area. So we are really fortunate to have some thought leaders in this whole area to explore with us and experiment with us, indeed, on these ideas. And I want to assure you that what you hear today and what you say today is going to be captured, and we are going to encapsulate into our next iteration of ICT for D at IDRC as we go into the planning phase for our next 5-year strategic plan and a new prospectus that we present to the Board of Governors next year for what this idea is going to look like. So once again, thank you so much for coming. I think it'll be a really exciting exercise in frontier investigation and exploration. So without further ado, I'm going to pass you over to Jesse Brown, which I'm really glad that Jesse was able to come here. Jesse is, many of you know, well, probably you don't, because he always sits off camera somewhere, doesn't he? Doing a lot of work for TVO and Steve Paikin. So without further ado, Jesse, over to you, who's going to introduce you to our invited guests.
Thank you, Michael. Way off camera. On the internet, as a matter of fact. Good afternoon, and thanks all for coming here today to the Alberta Bay Hotel in Ottawa. Hello to everybody here with us live, and hello to everybody watching via our live web stream, and hello to my podcast listeners who will be checking this out soon. We're here today to discuss openness, which is a very trendy word. We hear it more and more. We hear about open government that anyone can participate in, open networks that anyone can join, open source software and hardware that anyone can build upon, open access to information, to news, to research. Open. It just feels good to say it, doesn't it? Who would want to be against that? Nobody. Everybody wants to be associated with it. Just last summer here in Canada, our government wanted very much to be thought of as open. And they held an incredibly open national public consultation on the topic of copyright reform. There were town hall meetings throughout the country. You could come live, you could submit your comments, your thoughts through the internet. And not only was this held out in the open, but it was web streamed and everything was transcribed and shared openly. Anybody who wanted to have a say, to express their opinion of what this important piece of legislation should be, was encouraged to do so openly. Well, I just learned today, thanks to actually one of our panelists, that the results of this open consultation will, in all likelihood, be completely ignored. And the future of Canadian copyright law will be whatever our Prime Minister thinks it should be, or perhaps more accurately, whatever he is told it should be. Speaking of the United States, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton not long ago delivered this incredible landmark address, this historic speech on internet freedom around the world. And again, we heard this trendy word, open. She spoke of open networks and freedom, and she pledged United States government support for technologies that will allow citizens of repressive countries like Iran to not only circumvent censorship, but to do so anonymously. Some weeks later, a United States Federal Court of Appeals sided with the Recording Industry of America Association and sanctioned the unmasking of the identities of thousands of citizens who had been sharing files online anonymously. We talk of this trendy term open in terms of open access to technology. And we regard it as a human rights triumph when the news comes that almost half of the population of India has a cell phone. Over 500 million cell phones in India. Just remarkable. We learned through a United Nations piece of research that came out of Hamilton, Ontario. And somewhat less enthusiastically, we regard the news that only 366 million people in India have access to toilets. We talk of openness synonymously with transparency and sunlight, and we repeat like a mantra, sunlight, the best disinfectant. And it really can be. Exposing to public scrutiny, making open those things that happen privately where important decisions are made, it can hold decision makers to account and elected officials to account. It can do that. It can expose corruption. It can do that. But openness, perhaps, maybe it also can dazzle us and distract us. Maybe the sunlight can blind us. Maybe it can distract us from discussing less trendy subjects, the pesky details along the way, poverty, intellectual property, privacy, surveillance. Those pesky subjects are what we're here today to discuss. We're going to delve into this and discuss whether openness is an end unto itself or whether it is a tool for achieving some measurable good. And to do so, IDRC has assembled just an incredible panel of thinkers who I'd like to welcome to the stage now. Sunil Abraham is the executive director of the Center for Internet and Society. He is a social entrepreneur and free software advocate based in Bangalore. Please come up. Warm round of applause, please. Professor Ron Deibert is the director of the Citizen Lab at the Munk Center for International Studies, the University of Toronto. Been reading about Ron in the New York Times, unmasking cyber espionage networks. Warm round of applause for Ron Deibert. Professor Michael Geist is a law professor at the University of Ottawa, where he holds the Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce law. He's also a favorite source of leaks when it comes to Canadian tech policy. And Anita Gurumurthy is a founding member and executive director of IT for Change, an India-based NGO engaged in policy research and advocacy on information and communications technologies for development, ITC4D. Welcome, everyone, one more time. Warm round of applause. How's it going? You all have microphones? And just a note to everybody here and everybody with us through the web, there will be an occasion at the end for questions. And I think those who are watching via the web have instructions on how to submit them. Let's start big. Oh, I'm sorry. Joining us also, I've forgotten to introduce Professor Yochai Benkler, a law professor at Harvard University and co-director of Harvard's Berkman Center for Internet and Society, author of Wealth of Networks, who's joining us through the miracles of technology, I believe, on one of these screens any moment now. Professor Benkler, hello.
Hi. I hope you're hearing me fine.
Can you say hello once again? I think we got a low level there.
Can you hear me properly now? It's nice to be with you.
We can. It's nice to have you. Maybe we'll start with you. Professor Benkler, let's risk a definition here. What is openness to you?
Openness means that for any given class of resources necessary to be engaged in whatever the particular information, knowledge, or cultural production activity there is some component that is available for anyone who can and wants you to use them for purposes of whatever they're doing. So there are this is a very broad definition because it attaches to a very broad range of situations. So when we talk for purposes of copyright, an open system is one that provides a sufficient range of use rights for people who can create their own cultural materials to use the existing universe of knowledge to make their own new things. If we're talking about educational materials, then again, a particular set of materials being sufficiently open for teachers and schools to pull together. If we're talking about wireless spectrum or telecommunications, it means that there is a sufficient set of regulations that allows a wide range of types of organizations and people to engage in delivering materials. So in each context, it has a different meaning. But the overarching theme is one of non-discriminatory, low-cost or no-cost access to core resources necessary to produce and distribute information, knowledge, and culture.
Okay. Thank you very much. Anita, Gurumurthy, from your experience, how would you define openness?
I think in the context of IDRC and its agenda for development, it's instructive and useful to begin from the point of what is development, and in relation to that, what might be the meaning of openness. I completely agree with you that it's a very warm and fuzzy word, and it's very hard to say anything critical about openness. But I'm going to go back into history, because as always, history has something to tell all of us. Now, where was that word, openness, used before in history? 20 years ago? Glasnost? Do we remember? Well, at that time, it meant many things. It meant openness, transparency, and even truth. And it, of course, went hand in hand with the notion of perestroika, economic restructuring. Of course, the rest, as they say, is history. And now, in the erstwhile USSR and many countries of Central Asia and Eastern Europe, we see the aftermath of glasnost. And where is it most evident? Well, if any of you here is a feminist, this question is a no-brainer. Glasnost and perestroika changed the status of women dramatically, in almost a frying pan to the fire kind of way. Women in the Soviet regime carried double burdens, and Gorbachev's ideal of returning women to their womanly mission as keepers of the family was heralded by many, including women, as a solution to increasing social discontent of the late 80s. Creches were under pressure and the economy was not growing. It is 2 decades, and while many women took the path of so-called choice to opt out of the productive market, today, the collapse of public institutions and the loss of jobs and the consequent breakdown of social relationships has left women much, much worse off, with political and economic participation and educational attainments much lower than in erstwhile USSR. Also, violence against women in these societies has gone up, and the market economy has only meant for many girls in need of university fees, in need of money to pay university fees, many of these girls opting to go outside their countries as domestic help or as sex workers to come back and pay for their university fees. Now, if socialism and capitalism both didn't work, what went wrong? Well, again, the problem with glasnost was that it proceeded from a completely incorrect philosophy of gender equality, even if it did seem to empower women to make a choice to get a breather from the arduous double burdens of work and life. But glasnost did not ask the question, hey, what about sexual division of labor? Can men and women work outside home and at home? So there you are. As zen as it sounds, openness does not quite sit pretty as easily with development without complications. It could even be representative of a kind of destructive anarchy that disrupts, but it does not know how or what to reconstruct. So for me, it seems like it's a rhetoric that means multiple things, and we have to be really careful about what we mean, and that needs to proceed from our vision of what development is.
How about it? Is this a concept under which we can mask any number of campaigns, negative or positive? Does it have any inherent value, or is it merely a rhetorical device that could be as destructive as some of the things that Anita's brought up from history?
I think it's both, yeah. I think it's that and everything. It certainly has meaning for a lot of people. It has for me for many years, to describe some of the motivations I have and my colleagues have in terms of what it is that we aim to do, which has been for now nearly a decade to, as I describe it, lift the lid on things that are going on beneath the surface of the internet and cyberspace generally, and bring some transparency and accountability to processes that are largely hidden from public scrutiny. So it's a very powerful term to get at some of these motivations. But we shouldn't fool ourselves, as Anita eloquently put it here, that the term and the concept can have multiple meanings. It can be used as a rhetorical device, and it certainly will be co-opted. And that's what I think we have to be careful of moving forward, is that we look carefully and scrutinize how terms like these can mask power relations that very quickly adapt to a new environment, a new way of speaking, a new discursive paradigm. Wherever you have social relations, you have power. And that's where I think it's important that we understand, how do we constrain power? How do we expose power? How do we limit and shape it in ways that provide maximum transparency, a diversity of views, and a dialogue to happen?
Sunil, let's take this down to earth in a practical kind of meat and potato sense. Can this concept of openness make an actual impact? Can it make a difference in the field of development?
The trouble with openness is that it's increasingly an empty signifier. If you were to talk specifically of free and open source software or of open access, then there are established definitions, and there is worldwide consensus about those definitions. If you were to apply openness to standards, then there is a large contestation over the definition. Does it mean that there are patents involved with the standard? If there are patents, are those patents available on a royalty-free basis, etc.? And increasingly, as Ron pointed out, people use openness as a new form of greenwashing, whatever their standard agenda is. So it may not be useful for us to engage with openness in abstract, but when we debate openness in any area of development, we would have to deal with the specifics of that particular area. To give you another example from India, when the government in Karnataka, the state Anita and I come from, decided to engage with civil society and have residential welfare organizations tell the government what to do, they had these open consultation meetings in Infosys, which is a very large multinational corporation, and only middle-class Indians were able to participate in those meetings, take holidays from work, etc. So it meant that those living in slums, 30% of Bangalore's population, they had no voice in these so-called open consultations. They didn't have the expertise to understand these government documents and then comment upon them in an intelligent fashion. As Ron points out, you cannot apply openness in a blanket fashion. You would have to take into consideration the power dimension and then install a particular avatar of openness in each area, if you may.
Michael, you've taken a bit of a leadership position in popularizing certain policy initiatives in Canada and engaging with the public, and it seems like a lot of your work is informed by a base belief that the wider you open up a debate, in fact, if you can explode it open as widely as possible and engage as many people as possible, it can have an impact. Can it?
Well, apparently I'm pretty naive in thinking that it can, at least based on some of the stuff that we've seen over the last day or so with respect to copyright. I guess I'm going to continue to be naive, though, and hope that, in fact, it can. I mean, I think that openness is rarely an end to itself. I mean, I think that openness in the context, say, of open access to research is all about ensuring access to research, and open seems to be the best delivery mechanism to ensure that as many people as possible have access to that. Open access in the context of some networks is seen as the best end in many instances to try to help facilitate competition, lower prices, increase speeds, all of those kinds of things. In the context of policymaking, so whether it's been in Canada on issues like copyright or net neutrality, those are a couple of areas where I think openness in terms of open consultation and open participation at least have the effect and I think the ability to ensure that these issues move up the political ladder, so to speak, so that they get some attention. The public has an opportunity to ensure that their voice is heard. And in some ways, that alone represents a pretty big shift on some of these issues. If we think back, say, in the telecom space, 10 years ago, CRTC hearings were the purview of a small group of broadcast and telecommunications lawyers, and no one could ever be bothered to participate, much less tune in. And last summer we had a traffic management hearing in Canada that hundreds of people were sitting in, watching the streams and actively participating and putting in their views. And the same is true for copyright, as you mentioned, with the consultation. The big challenge, though, is that that participation isn't an end of itself. I mean, the goal is to ultimately ensure that those views are appropriately reflected in policy, and it's clear we still have a little bit of ways to go until we get to that point.
Following this idea of openness as the possibility that it's a wolf in sheep's clothing, when you open something up, when you open up communications, when you open up people's private lives, and you extol the virtues of this, and perhaps it becomes an end unto itself, is there a flip side? Is there a danger? And I'm thinking specifically of the argument that when people are oversharing, the possibility for government surveillance becomes greater. What happens to our privacy, and who does it benefit when we open up on the personal level? Professor Ron Deibert, I think that you'd be the right person to kick off this topic, having recently exposed, how many botnet networks now is it?
Oh, that's closed proprietary information. I can't discuss that. Well, yes, to get to your basic point here about surveillance, there is a problem that we've kind of backed ourselves into, I think is the way I would put it, socially speaking. With social networking and a great deal of open collaboration and more openness around the way we communicate with each other, we often don't think about the unintended consequences of technological change in this respect. One of them has been what I and others have described as a kind of auto surveillance, where people willingly put forward information about themselves that assists surveillance. However, I think that some of the concerns are misplaced, popular concerns anyway, which tend to focus on the big brother of the state. And I think the bigger concern, frankly, are the private companies that own and operate the infrastructure and act as the intermediaries for the communications ecosystem that we live in. So the telecom operators, the internet service providers, many of whom don't really care about our private lives so much unless it makes them money in some way, or if they are regulated into caring about it because they are a proxy for law enforcement or intelligence. And I think that's where, again, we have to, first of all, expose what's going on, make people aware of issues like default privacy settings Michael brought up in an earlier setting today, which kind of streamline people into being more comfortable with a complete erosion of privacy. With respect to privacy as a whole, I think it's a basic right that I think is eroding so fast, and I think there's, as much as privacy commissioners are very active today and are working frantically with colleagues in jurisdictions around the world to push for regulations, the momentum is so far in the other direction because of both technical and institutional changes and changes in everyday social practices. You know, I tag myself in photos and I tag my colleagues, and my kids write about their schools and where they're journeying and where they eat and what their pets are and everything, and it just really concerns me at a fundamental social level.
Professor Benkler, our privacy commissioner here in Canada, recently led an effort with 9 other regulators from different countries, chiding Google and Facebook for disclosing an unprecedented and inappropriate amount of personal information. Are these worries warranted? It seems that we're all very concerned about something and we don't exactly know what it is. How people have suffered through these divulging of this information, I'm not sure people necessarily care. You have been an advocate of what can be achieved through the open exchange of information. Do you think that these worries are sort of exaggerated?
Well, the issue, I think, is not necessarily exaggeration of the concerns. It's precisely the excessive breadth of the use of the term openness as though it's a target. And I think this came out in the first round of questions, and I definitely want to align myself with the idea that while the concept is broad, we need to make it concrete in discrete settings so that it means different things in different settings in detail. The basic problem is the problem of power and the problem of different concentrations of power coming to apply on people through control over one or another resource, whether it's information about who's funded whom in government when you talk about transparency, whether it's information about what particular set of things you bought that then allows somebody to control the flow of information to and from you in a way that's intended to get you to buy one thing or another. You might find yourself in a situation where the concern with power, in this case of a particular set of companies to shape the consumption preferences of certain users, says to you, openness in this case doesn't just, openness itself is flipped on its head because the locus of control over information, that is to say the subject, the individual, is not somebody who's powerful relative to Google or Facebook. And so in that regard, the push to openness as a push to diffuse power over individuals, whether it's by companies or by government, in each case, one of the things is it's always to identify what is the particular source of power and then how you deploy access to or no access to resources in order to complicate and make that power less directly able to shape people's lives. So if we come back to your question, to say in the interest of openness, we need to make sure that Google and Facebook can use information about individuals without constraints based on privacy is to miss the fact that openness plays a very discrete role in a way that's intended to undermine power. And in this case, it's actually the ability to segment power. This is something that Helen Nissenbaum has written a lot about in the context of privacy, the ability to segment power and control the information flows around yourself as an individual is actually the mechanism by which you resist being put in a position where others can control you.
And the others in these instances would be the Googles, the Facebooks, but also the internet service providers of the world. Is the emphasis then on keeping their power in check?
Exactly. And again, the point is not bad corporations versus bad government. There's sometimes this symmetric framework. There can be all sorts of different sources of power. The power can be domestic in terms of relationships between parents and their young adult kids and efforts by the state to interject control by parents over young adults so that they can't explore new and countercultural things that they're doing. It might be schools versus their students. You have to identify specific social situations and say, in this situation, in this country, it might be wealthy, it might be poorer, who exercises power over whom? How can we engage that exercise of power as something that we, whoever the we is, the we might be the state intervening against a company, it might be a civil society organization interjecting against the state, it might be technology developers interjecting against all of others. Whoever the we are who are morally bound to create an open system that resists power, who is exercising power over whom by control over which resource? And whether or not we open or close that resource is based on our predictions to the best we can of how doing so will allow one party to exercise power over another in a way that we take to be morally inappropriate.
I have a feeling that we are about to start discussing net neutrality and ACTA and WIPO and perhaps other acronyms. Before we do, Anita, are we missing the point in doing so? Are these very fine-grained digital policy questions taking us away from more practical concerns that the development community should be more concerned about?
I really think that if indeed development is political, then I think as the discussion here is, veering towards, the questions are essentially about power relations, and politics. And so if we really connect openness to development, as you would probably connect globalization to development, then you have to really get, as Yochai said, very specific in different contexts. And so when you examine access to information or participation in emerging groups and networks, or you explore the questions about collaboration in over different networks, the questions for us would come back to where are the nodes of power. And for me, I think there's one more pesky word. You mentioned poverty, you mentioned other things. I think the other pesky word is, of course, the question of democracy. And I think there is a lot of hype and too many myths floating around which are tremendously atheoretical about the connections between openness, technology, and democracy. And indeed, I mean, all of us, if we understood democracy, I think it would be a perfect world, and we don't, so we are here. But I think it's important to look at the mobile revolution, and when you talk about the masses, the billions who in India own mobile phones, I think it's time that we stop celebrating this as the totem of, the information society, to pay attention not only to the fact that mobiles are closed architectures, but also, I think, the presumption that social movements, which are very, very critical for moving societies from one level of development to the next, which anchor, processes of social change, the assumption that social movements and social protest is actually built upon Web 2.0 or, on social networking, I think really needs to be critiqued. And here I think I'd really like to borrow from my readings on Morozov and his critique of Twitter, and he points to how he points to two things. One is about the flash mob kids in Belarus in 2006. And the assumption that many of us have that, you can just get on to, this virtual space and organize a community and bring about change, as if you can blog away a dictatorship, and you can avoid all that, dirty, bloody politics, which is not true. So development is dirty. Development is about the lives of people, and it's about aspirations, symbolic issues, and material issues. The second thing that Morozov says is really interesting. He talks about, the Habermas in public sphere and says how at the time at which cafes and newspapers, were seemingly on the rise, was also the time that some of the philosophers at that time were really worried that there were far too many public opinions floating around, and it was rather easy for people to align behind too many issues which actually undermined the revolution. in some ways. So, I mean, if you talk about these pesky words of poverty, of gender relations, of democracy, I think we need to really stop being naive and start thinking about what the relationship may be between openness and development that is actually mediated through politics. Stop here.
Ron, I'm still bruised from my last go-round with Evgeny Morozov, and I've been, in a dark mood ever since. Yeah, but I can hear his voice now in my head telling me that all of this talk of openness is merely a fetish. And as somebody who has dedicated himself to providing censorship circumvention tools to revolutionary communities and to the citizens of repressed countries. Is Morozov wrong? Does it matter? Is this the first step, or is this a diversion from where the real revolution is going to come from?
I think he's right to a certain degree. He's done a good job, I think, splashing cold water on a lot of groundless enthusiasm about social networking technologies and the role they play in many parts of the world. So no doubt about it with him on that, I agree. At the same time, I think we have to be careful not to swing too far in the other direction and underestimate the extent to which today, even in places about which Morozov speaks, these technologies are still very important. And sometimes, in some parts of the world, new media, cyberspace, the internet, whatever you want to call it, is the only viable alternative for opposition movements to express themselves because the state controls traditional media. And certainly judging by the degree to which authoritarian and non-democratic regimes focus on these technologies today, it's important to them because they understand that it's a tool for a very powerful tool for social mobilization. So much so, in fact, that they're working to insinuate themselves into those very tools. So you have, for example, elements of the state, intelligence networks, masking themselves as pro-democracy movements, using Twitter and other social networking tools, monitoring people's Facebook accounts, not only in the countries but abroad, and intimidating people through what they find on these platforms. Which brings me, I guess, to another topic that I'd like to introduce here, and that is that I believe the domain that we speak of here, I call it cyberspace, whatever you want to call it, this ecosystem, the communications ecosystem, is being heavily militarized today. And I think that's a dramatic shift in the way in which, in the context around all of this, that we have to approach a lot of these questions with. Because it's different than 10 years ago, it's different than 20 years ago. Now we have governments around the world standing up the capacity to fight and win wars in this domain. We have to be careful at the same time not to buy into a lot of the hyperbole around cyber war, cyber security that's generated by mostly private companies that stand to make a profit around this, or interests within inside the beltway who are trying to amplify threats for their own concerns. At the same time, though, there is a very real militarization going on. U.S. Cyber Command has been set up. Most of the countries around the world are looking into these same basic doctrines. Those have real implications for real people, and I see it every day in my research in many parts of the world where the absence of a normative frame around this, and in fact a vacuum that's being created by this militarization, creates an opportunity for some vicious people to do some terrible things at a lower level. And I think that's something that, really I feel needs to be introduced into this discussion.
Well, let's do so, and let's see where this militarization, or this proposed militarization of the internet, fits into these larger policy questions. When we talk about cyber warfare, I don't think it's possible to do so without talking about the ability for the state to survey, without talking, if the internet is dispersed and distributed and no one has any particular higher degree of power or oversight, that might be a problem to a campaign of militarization. When we talk about seemingly unrelated topics such as ACTA, are we actually talking about a means through which control can be exerted and anonymity can be exposed? Is everything here linked in that sense? Michael?
So I was tempted to take on Evgeny's proposition, which maybe I'll have a chance to later on. But because we sit on a board together, and it feels like he follows. I'm going to, and then I'll answer your question, because I want to say he's wrong. He's only right if you believe that if you recognize that what he's done is set up a straw man that says there are people out there who believe that you can change the world or change governments on the basis of a few mouse clicks. I haven't met those people. The only time I ever hear about them is from Evgeny. I actually think...
Michael, he found many books from 1994.
Yeah, you know what? I actually think having tried to build communities around things like copyright, it is bloody hard. You don't get, even if you want to discount what a Facebook group looks like, I'm here to tell you, it's not easy to build a Facebook group of 90,000 people or 100,000 people or 220,000 people as we had with the Facebook group against the Parliament proroguing. The truth of the matter is this does represent something. Now, it doesn't represent the way to change everything from people sitting in front of their computer screen, but building those sorts of communities can and does make a difference, and I would argue that it is an integral part of any campaign, regardless of whether we're talking on small policies or big government. I mean, if you are not including that, even for something as crass as trying to raise funds to try to do it, or to try to educate, or to try to get people out there, then you're missing a core part, and frankly, if you've got people who are promoting something on the other side, you're probably going to lose something because they're promoting something there. Now, to answer your actual question about ACTA, I actually don't, God, so I spent a lot of time criticizing ACTA and working on ACTA, but I don't see ACTA in the way that you've just described it. I don't see it as somehow related or an extension of some militarizing of the internet. I see it.
What does the acronym stand for?
Oh, sorry, ACTA, for those that aren't following this, is the Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement, which is this semi-secret, it's not even semi-secret anymore since the government's actually went ahead and released the text, draft text a couple of weeks ago, that a number of governments, Canada, the United States, European Union, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and a couple of others have been negotiating for the last couple of years. It's described as an anti-counterfeiting agreement. Nobody can, who's going to be against that? It turns out that it's not really a counterfeiting agreement at all. It's actually a copyright and intellectual property agreement with some counterfeiting provisions, but by and large, it's about intellectual property-related issues. And I don't see that as a military-related component or a government takeover. I do see it as a pretty clear attempt, something we've seen for the last 10 to 15 years of linking trade policy with intellectual property policy. And rather than having the inconvenience of doing this on a country-by-country basis, it's far more convenient to do it by way of a single standard or a single treaty and make the effort to sort of try to push everybody, even whether you've participated in the process or not, to become part of that. Now, I think ACTA has potentially huge implications, certainly for privacy, for cultural sovereignty and cultural policy. But at the same time, it's important to recognize both what it is and what it isn't. And I don't see this as a world government. I see it as a clear threat to the multilateral approach we've had on intellectual property policy in the past. Up until a couple of weeks ago, I think it represented a significant threat in terms of how open or transparent our governments are with respect to negotiations around these sorts of things. And I guess to link Morozov's point with ACTA, I think one need only look to what we've seen in ACTA in the last couple of weeks to recognize that those mouse clicks can have an effect. So governments in 2007 when they started this, and in 2008, and in 2009, and even in January of 2010, were absolutely adamant that there was no way they were going to release the text on an official basis to the public because this just wasn't the way you did things when it came to these kinds of negotiations. But a lot of people used their mice and used blogs and Twitter and tried to encourage the mainstream media to cover this issue and created enough of a storm and made it sufficiently inconvenient that at the highest levels of the US government and other governments, they decided that this was beginning to become a threat to actually getting this thing passed and decided it was far better to make it available than otherwise. People didn't have to take the streets to that, but they did have to use the same technologies that we're talking about around social media, and frankly, it helped make it happen.
I guess if the question is what does a Facebook group of 300,000 or 200,000 angry people accomplish, if those 200,000 people are angry at you, it might accomplish something.
Yes, I think that's probably right.
Professor Benkler, what do you think? Is Michael right? Am I stretching things? Am I setting up a bit of a false dichotomy here? Do we have, whether it be in the guise of anti-counterfeit laws or trying to protect against child pornography, or be it an internet service provider trying to manage their networks so that they're not crippled by people doing peer-to-peer file sharing. Is that all encumbrances on the free and open exchange of information? And on the other side of the equation, we have this, this virtuous cycle of people freely and openly exchanging things, and that's what needs to be protected? We're not hearing you. Let's get, no. Anything in the back, any ideas? What's that? Is it? Sorry? It's on his end? We think you're muted, Professor. Maybe as the good professor tries to figure it out, we'll hear Sunil's thoughts on it.
Yeah, I wanted to use the great developmental theorist Bono of U2 to link this actor business and also cyber war. So Bono recently wrote an article, and he says that if China can do such a good job censoring political speech on the internet, and if America can do such a good job blocking child pornography on the internet,
proceed, we'll try to figure this out well.
How come we can't solve the problem of piracy? IP maximalists, the rights holders, those who own intellectual property, have been using a range of strategies in order to precipitate policy reactions. The first generation of these strategies was to compare piracy to drugs. And they would say in Malaysia to the government that one CD and one joint of marijuana roughly costs the same amount. But if you're caught with one joint, you go to prison for a year. But if you're caught with a CD, nothing happens to you. So shouldn't there be some equitable way of treating them under the law? That was the first generation of propaganda. That didn't manage to convince many governments. Then they moved into child pornography. That became the reason why piracy should be cracked down upon. And finally, we've reached cyber war. The truth is that in many developing countries, we have the benefit of air gap. Most of our military systems are very old, and they're not connected to the internet. It's very unlikely that you can compromise India militarily through the internet. At the most, you could compromise a couple of websites, etc. But the primary agenda behind bringing up cyber war is to precipitate these type of knee-jerk policy responses. They know that this is how governments are going to react. So I think Bono is very useful in understanding this.
I read that he's going to be editing the Globe and Mail for a day. So
he's also coming to perform just in time for the discussion on copyright.
It's very exciting. As a journalist, I hope to sing on his next album. We can do a little exchange. Let me just ask the technicians if we have Professor Benkler back. Any? We're trying? So just let me know when we can hear him. I suppose...
Can I make a comment just in response to Sunil?
Please.
I agree for the most part, especially about the Bono copyright issue, no doubt about it, and that's a great example to bring up. With respect to the issue of air-gapped internet as a security measure, I think we have to be careful here. In fact, many governments, in part because of the activities of organizations like IDRC and others, have rushed to embrace new information and communication technologies without properly considering security. And so, and especially in many developing countries, I've seen this rush to embrace these technologies happen where they've leapfrogged over several generations of technical systems, and in doing so, left many critical gaps when it comes to security. I don't agree that the Indian government can't be compromised. I know myself quite directly, that they can be in very significant ways. And I think it's the same for many countries around the world. And in fact, because of this condition, let's call it, that we've entered into now, there is a new form of espionage where you don't need globe-spanning satellites and echelon-like systems to extract useful information. You can do so over the internet.
All of this is happening so rapidly, and we talk about over 500 million cell phones in India. That didn't happen necessarily because of development efforts. The technology moves through its own development, through commercial incentives at such a rapid pace, and it is adopted and spreads throughout the world at an incredibly rapid pace. And what people do with it happens at an incredibly rapid pace. Are we counting the number of angels on a pin here? When we talk about legislation around technology, when we talk about policy around technology, can we ever keep up with the speed of the technology itself? And can what we decide, and in the we, I'm talking about decision makers and policymakers and all the legal branches and privacy commissioners, everybody who's debating this stuff, are these debates relevant? Can they have an effect? And is the professor?
Yeah, I'm here, I think.
Okay. All right, welcome back.
Thank you. It turns out old-fashioned batteries also need to be...
What do you think, Professor Benkler? Can thought leaders keep up with the technology? And does what you say matter?
I would hope so. So this is a real question, and I think one that anyone who has been working on technology and technology policy for a while has to, in some sense, ask themselves. My own position for myself is that we won't be able to know until it's too late to affect our behavior, and so we have to assume that it is. And in the worst case scenario, we've created a lot of heat without much light exposed. My own sense is that actually policy can nudge things in various directions to a point where it can influence them for better or for worse. One example, for example, is peer-to-peer file sharing. If you look at the Napster decision in 2000 in the US, the critical thing that it did was shift peer-to-peer from being a potentially mainstream embedded in every single operating system that is shipped into something that is always, in some sense, sub rosa. And so we haven't had, in fact, the growth to beyond 25 to 30% of internet users at any given time using P2P file sharing, whereas it would have been 100%. Now, does it matter? It matters. It matters to the way that music gets distributed. It matters to the sense that other media. Is it completely effective? No. So the answer is it's not irrelevant, but it's not completely effective. And the question is still what needs to be done. On this, I have to say, I'm a little baffled by the focus within the conversation on development, on militarization, and the very heavy emphasis on the rhetoric of openness. Because I wonder to what extent, when we're talking in the context of development, the questions need to be much more practical and much more specific about what kinds of systems. So for example, the question you raised about incentives and mobile. There's a question on the table. You look at what Ronaldo Lemos has been writing about land houses in Brazil as a context in which something that was a basic subsidy for computer systems instigated what is a semi-pirate market, but not an open market, not open systems, by comparison to a much more structured government process with telecenters that are based on open platforms all the way down, free and open source software, etc. That's a real challenge because suddenly you have a market, classic small-scale market based on property rights in computers, succeeding in the favelas in a way that the government subsidized open centers. That's a challenge to my mind, and one that we need to chew on in thinking about the relationship between open and proprietary, between market-based systems and government investment. I would love to have the conversation focused on those questions, at least to some extent, and the question of whether openness has become too much for too many people is in my mind less germane to the debate.
Anita?
Yeah, thanks for nudging us in that direction. I think that it's important to really look at this question of the self-propelling, autonomous, kind of diffusion of technology. Of course, it's desirable. I mean, I would want a mobile phone, and I presume everyone would want to have a mobile phone. And I don't think there's any dispute around, whether that's desirable or not. I mean, it's as simple as the human propensity to communicate, and so everyone would want to communicate. Now, the question really is, when this kind of autonomous diffusion of mobile phones and users and consumers, these networks are getting formulated, there is this totalizing propensity of technological networks which markets use to organize complex systems of management and production. And in relation to development, what you actually see, for instance, in the context of India and many celebrated cases like Yochai, for instance, you really see that at the level of the local community, the coming in of corporate-controlled telecenters actually means, creation of channels of value outflow. So what you're actually seeing is that the local economy gets compromised. In many ways, you see a certain new dependency on global markets. And of course, there is this extremely generous bashing of the middlemen, which is usually found in all the best practices documentation about telecenters. Now, the questions really here are about the connections between the global and the local. And what you actually see is that if we were to examine the question of incentives and disincentives and policy, can you really have an openness, which is without having the public? So, I mean, for me, you need to really claim and reclaim the public if you're going to define development as, as not just, anarchy, but as Derrida said, responsible anarchy, where you not only bring down institutions, but you actually know how in the historical continuity of things, you're able to reconstruct them. And in that, I think to address questions of institutions, of social justice and equity, you really have to look at trade-offs. And, I mean, I do understand, and I'm not really very well informed about it, but I certainly know that the whole question of privacy is also linked, on the other hand, to the onus on public institutions to put out information, and that's a tension because for many people who are socioeconomically disadvantaged, it's really important to have information in the public domain. So how do you reconcile these questions? And these are issues which have deep tensions. I also must add that while we examine issues of open knowledge, we can't but we will have to take cognizance of the fact that increasingly the battleground is in the blurring lines between the public and the private. So you're having a trend, not just in India, but in many developing countries, where public educational institutions are getting privatized. So, what you see is, on the one hand, these moves and incentives to adopt, let's say, Creative Commons license, etc. But on the other hand, you really don't have incentives, to actually adopt, these collaborative processes that push you in the direction of the commons. So for me, I think the questions around social justice and equity would be, how can you have access to information which promotes the agency of people? How can you have a participation in these emerging networks that also promotes a politics? And how can you have collaboration that also promotes appropriation, appropriation of local surpluses?
Sunil, as an entrepreneur and as somebody who's seen this play out in practical situations, I think, the Thomas Friedmans and the Nicholas Negropontes would have us believe that perhaps you put a cell phone or a $100 laptop in a poor child's hands, and the world is his or her oyster. Have you seen practical benefits? Have you seen that connection leading to something tangible?
When Thomas Friedman comes to Bangalore, he gets into a taxi and drives straight into the IT district, and the government makes sure, the government in Bangalore, that the IT district never faces any power cuts. And so he sees a completely different Bangalore than the Bangalore I live in, on the outskirts of the city, where we have about 4 hours of power cut on a daily basis. So you shouldn't go by what Mr. Friedman says. With Negroponte's one laptop per child, it's not really a technological innovation, it's a sales target, really, when you say that you want to sell one laptop per child. While he claims that it's based on constructivist education, there's nothing really in the sugar operating system that one can connect to the work of Piaget or Montessori. So it's missing what one would call the content, the open educational resources or open content that should be on these devices. Some Latin American countries are picking up this idea, but in India it still remains purely in pilot format. Where is the real change? Again, going back to mobile phones, I was in an auto rickshaw. In Thailand, you call them tuk-tuks. Traveling from office to my home, and midway, the auto rickshaw driver took a phone call, and then he said, "I'm sorry, you now have to get off because I have something else to do." The maidservant that services several apartments in my flat will call us or organize her day in a much more efficient manner because she can now negotiate with several employers using the mobile phone. So there is a huge tangible impact. And coming back to policy work and activism and Michael's critique of Evgeny's position, at the World Intellectual Property Organization, several civil society organizations are lobbying for the treaty for the visually impaired. This will bring exceptions and limitations so that the blind and other print-challenged persons can access copyrighted works. And the coordination both internationally and nationally is done completely over email. So NGOs across India were able to hold parallel press conferences and therefore leverage several column centimeters of press coverage thanks to modern technology. So we are definitely seeing the benefit of modern technology, and the benefits, in my opinion, clearly outweigh the risks. But the risks do exist, and we have to constantly keep them in mind. It isn't as if these risks only emerge from really sophisticated technology like Facebook and Twitter. They can emerge from a very simple standardization. In India, we now have a proposal to introduce a unique identity number. So all the government will do, if one forgets the biometrics behind the project, is assign each citizen with a unique number. It's a standardization of identity. But what will happen is hospitals and insurance companies will be able to synchronize databases. So you don't really need complicated technology to be a threat to democracy or open societies. A very simple standardization on a number can also be a threat. In Gujarat, when the Muslims were targeted, people were roaming through the city with a census database in one hand, a sword in the other hand, a mobile phone in their pocket. That's how 5,000 Muslims were murdered in Gujarat. So all network technologies can come with huge social costs, but they also come with huge social benefits.
Let's conclude. I'd like each of you to answer this briefly, if you can. And I say this, I'm sorry for this question. You know, if you cover, as a journalist, let's say if you cover politics in Ottawa, every day you report on what happened today. That's what you're asked, what happened today. If you cover technology, you're asked what's going to happen in 10 years. The iPad came out. Is this a game changer? I don't know. So the question is, what do you want to see happen in 10 years? If we could kind of look forward, not what do you think will happen, but what, and you can kind of interpret this question any way you want, whether it be through a focus of development or in terms of policy here in Canada. Everything we're talking about now is speculative. We're trying to lay a foundation through which these networks can build and grow and have positive impacts. What are those impacts? Let's talk practically about that. Michael, perhaps you can start.
Okay. Let's only pick a couple of areas. I'll start with open access and open educational resources. So if we're talking in a 10-year time frame, I think in 10 years, those that, the works that are published by researchers, particularly in places like Canada and the United States, but frankly in many institutions around the world, the ones that are not available under OA are the exception rather than the rule. And I think we're there on the medical side. It's already 20% of medical research is already OA. If we're at 10 years, it ought to be 90 or approaching 100%, I think, in some of those areas. And I think the gains that we've seen in open access begin to be mirrored on open educational resources as well. So we start seeing more and more texts, both at post-secondary, but even at secondary and at junior levels, made available, openly available. So I think that OA comes full to fruition. I mean, I think there's a lot of momentum there, and it's one that I would hope by and large isn't stopped and can't be stopped. On intellectual property, I sure hope that I'm not sending out yet another blog post for the 8th time a bill is about to be introduced, and they really are going to introduce the Canadian DMCA this time. I actually think, I think it's easy to be pessimistic right now about what things look like in 10 years, but I'm actually going to be optimistic in all of this. I think there is still in the short term around intellectual property rules or even around some of the network rules, I think that there's a real prospect that the kind of fighting or the sort of the public policy battle that we've seen over the last number of years will continue. But the one thing that I think is on the side of those pushing for better balance with respect to copyright and ensuring better access is frankly time and demographics. And so it seems to me that we're already at the point, I was talking about this to someone just before the panel began, we're already at the point that that a growing number of people who will vote in the next election, whenever that election happens to be, can scarcely remember a world without the internet, and certainly a sizable number of people can scarcely remember a world without the personal computer. If we fast forward to that 10 years, we're now talking about almost every Canadian under 45, at least, not being able to remember a world without a PC, 35 or so not being able to remember a world without the internet. That's a pretty powerful demographic in terms of the way policies get made, and it also becomes increasingly the demographic from which ministers and leaders themselves are drawn from. And so I guess I'm a believer that on some of these issues that seem so difficult today, I think I know clearly who wins at the end of the day. The issue is whether or not we spend the next 5 or 10 years locked in this continual battle between sometimes demographics, certainly between different industries, those that are adapting, those that aren't, and then at the end of the day recognize that this has been a rather foolish fight, or can we get there quicker? And I think the countries that get there quicker, that represent the real benefits that can accrue from that, are the ones that will set themselves up longer term to take real advantage.
The question is not whether the open internet will proliferate, it's just who's going to be standing where when it does.
Well, I'm not referring just to the open internet. I think the threats that people like Ron have identified and even that Evgeny are going to recognize are real. And I don't think governments aren't going away. And so some of those issues are going to continue to remain. I guess I'm thinking more in the policy context, particularly, I guess in some ways I'm talking largely about access to information. Access to information, whether from the prospect of research, and there I think I'm very optimistic about where things are headed, but access to information, even the creation of information, the creation of culture, whose rules are largely bounded through intellectual property, I am a short-term pessimist but a long-term optimist.
Professor Ron Deibert.
Well, I guess the way I'd answer it is I believe that obviously the future is yet to be written and there are many contingent paths here, and I think that it's quite possible we could look back at the last 20 years and look at it fondly as a kind of a unique moment in history where we had this global communications platform that was relatively unregulated, unrestricted, and open to a certain degree, and that moment quickly shut and passed, and it degraded into something else entirely. And you know, I don't want to engage in fear-mongering, but there is enough evidence based on the research that me and my colleagues have been engaged in over the last 10 years to suggest that governments and other actors are intervening in this space in ways that are largely unaccountable, without transparency, doing so as part of a general securitization process. Colleagues in the very room that Professor Benkler is sitting in the Berkman Center for Internet and Society and me have helped document this. And it's enough to give me pause and to openly advocate for something else. And to the way I've tried to think about it is in terms of a social movement globally to protect the internet, to protect cyberspace as a forum for basic human rights. And that has to come at a grassroots level. So ideally for me, looking ahead, I would like to see something along the lines of what I've had the good fortune to participate in the last little while. One of the projects, which actually was sponsored by IDRC, OpenNet Initiative Asia, where we've had projects in countries throughout the Asia region that are employing the basic methods of the OpenNet Initiative to monitor cyberspace for censorship, surveillance, use a very thoughtful, reflective methodology that combines many different disciplines to monitor the ecosystem within which they live and help raise awareness about issues of censorship and surveillance and privacy and help advocate for a better future. To me, I'd like to see that duplicated and proliferate all around the world, because if we are going to build a notion of cyberspace security that's about protecting privacy, access to information, freedom of speech, however that emerges in local context, it has to come from below, from people being empowered to do the type of research that we've been involved in. And that's why, as I say, I've been grateful to have been given this opportunity by IDRC to help build those networks in Asia.
Professor Benkler, 2020, what do you say?
Thankfully, you asked for a hope, not a prediction. What would you like to see rather than what you think will happen? So I'll use that liberally. I think what I'd like to see is in the political system an openness, a cultural openness to seeing people as telling their own stories and inquiring for themselves. A push in terms of policy to require standardization of government data alongside analysis tools that will allow people locally to say, here, the local person who exercised control over the licenses here has wronged me. And there is a system that will make it such that it is difficult for somebody to be wronged in that way, because there are easy metrics, and to push that. I'd like to see growing practices of people providing their own alternative sources of discourse. We see it a little bit in some parts of the blogosphere in the US and in Canada. You half mentioned here or there Michael's role in pushing on technology policy in Canada, but that's something that is enabled by an open public discourse that allows someone to say, I care about this, and even though I'm not backed by this or that commercial interest, I can still get my word out and get however many people on a Facebook group that will actually make a difference. I'd like to see not only scientists but also teachers adopt practices of developing their own open educational materials and large adoption of the kind of translation efforts that we've seen here and there, be it the TED videos, but more impressively Global Voices, of actually doing translation, both cultural and linguistics. I'd like to see broader practices of people saying, we can come to the state of the art in software and offer software services over open source platforms because we don't have to pay a licensing fee to whoever owns it. And I'd like to see markets open to saying, what is the best person writing software wherever they happen to be, who's capable of doing this, building on an open software infrastructure, and so on and so forth. The critical thing to understand in the difference between the hope and the prediction is that none of this is inevitable. The technology will not make any of this inevitable, and there are distinct pushes both by owners of content and, as you say, by governments pushing a cybersecurity agenda, trying to shut down the relative openness. You asked about the iPad. I think the iPad is irrelevant, but the iPhone isn't, because of the centrality of the mobile form factor. And which of these two trends, the relatively controlled platform or the open platform on which people can develop, will end up being the primary platform for billions of people, will be an absolutely critical decision. So that's both on one hand my hope, and on the other hand the risk structure that I see.
Professor Benkler made reference to Global Voices. It's Global Voices Online, which many of you know. They do wonderful work in translating blogs from around the world very rapidly. Check it out. Anita, Gurumurthy, what's your hope for 2020?
I don't know. I think even till today, I feel terribly overwhelmed by technologies and the way in which each day we see something new. But I think my hope would be that there's change taking place in two spheres. One is the sphere of production and production relations, and the other is the sphere of social reproduction and changes to norms and practices of the kind that Sunil was talking about, that I would really like to see, from a feminist perspective, this entire emphasis on what new technologies can do to power at micro levels and meso levels, in terms of how the everyday reproduces itself. How domestic helps back home can call up and say, sorry, I'm not coming today, or the way in which caste can be redefined in some ways, and probably I think I have hope for that more than I have hope for the changes in production relations, where I really, really think and do agree with the points made here that a lot really depends on how the global policy spaces in relation to technology pan out. And there, I think governments of developing countries are at a terrible disadvantage, whether it's, telecommunications in the WTO or, intellectual property and WIPO or the IGF. And I think at national levels, for, a Gandhian, vision of small is beautiful to actually emerge, which I think is hugely probable. If you really look at probability, it's hugely probable. But whether it'll be plausible is really is a big question. In terms of you're being able to stand firmly, on your ground and keep your windows open to allow the world to really, to be able to embrace the world. So I think in that sense, where the digital public goods will be and how the digital ecology would be will determine much of that.
Finally, Sunil Abraham.
I'll make 3 points, one on climate change, the second on intellectual property, and the third on old technologies. On climate change, so far we've seen a lot of intensive sharing of digital resources, the intangible commons. I'm hoping that in order to deal with a world or a planet with limited resources and ever-expanding demands from the human race, there will be increased sharing of physical resources, and that would be enabled through ICTs. As far as intellectual property goes, I hope that in the coming 10 years, policymakers will begin to look at intellectual property just as they consider tangible property and capital, and the systems of rent on tangible property and capital, and try and make it much more complex. To give you 2 stories from India, and here I'm hoping that unlike in the past, where laws and judicial precedence flows from the west to the east, that in the future, both laws and judicial precedence will begin to flow from the east to the west as well. So the first item from India is Shah Rukh Khan, who's an actor in India. And if you know, actors no longer sing songs for the movies they act in. The songs are sung by playback singers. The actors only lip sync. So one of the comments he made on the upcoming amendment to Indian copyright law is that in the attention economy, the actor standing in front of the camera and lip syncing is making an equal contribution to this cultural object, which is the song, just as the playback singer or the lyricist. And that's a very interesting way of considering how the attention economy is configured. So that type of thinking might shift into other countries. Or the other case in India is a very important Supreme Court decision which says that all Indians have a right to watch cricket. So even if the signal is proprietary, the state broadcaster can provide the same signal without charging any fee. So I'm hoping that such types of laws and judicial precedents will begin to migrate to the West, especially to deal with the poor here. And the last hope is with old technologies. We are beginning to see the dismantling of license regimes on new technology, but still FM radio, etc., is highly controlled technologies in the developing world. I'm hoping that policymakers will get a little more confident after dismantling license regimes on new technologies and free up old technologies such as FM radio as well.
Can we have a very warm round of applause for our panelists today? Professor Ron Deibert has to catch a plane, so he'll be leaving us right now. But we have time for questions for the rest of our panel. So
can I just say thanks, Jesse, and thanks to Sunil and Michael and Anita and Yochai, and say hi to everybody at the Berkman Center for me. And thanks to all of you. I'm sorry I've got to run.
Thank you, Rob. Who will start things off for us? Usually there's a lag, and then as soon as there's one, we get rolling. There we go.
My question is this. I think open access today has got a very soft ride in the discussion. And I say so from a particular perspective as somebody who works in research in Africa. And I would ask in that context whether open access is not merely entrenching given the power relations that operate, particularly in research communications, but down the line into the kind of translation that Yochai Benkler spoke about. If we simply say that open access is great and putting everything online, open and free, and creating open resources is the way to go, are we not simply going to create a situation where we continue not to participate in knowledge production, where the voices of people, researchers, and development workers in Africa are still silent? And perhaps to conclude a little abrasively, if in ICT for development, a donor organization like the IDRC asks its researchers to publish articles in ISI journals and make them open access, is that open access ICT for development?
Who'd like to take this? Michael's making a vague motion towards...
Yeah, I guess at least where we stand today with respect to open access, I see, the benefits to the researchers, whether coming from the north or the south, to in many respects be equal. I think that, the studies that we've seen around open access suggest that those that publish under open access have their work more widely read, more widely cited, and have a greater impact. And it seems to me that's applicable regardless of where you come from. I think there needs to be, and is some work, I think, focused on how do you ensure that the researchers coming from the South have the ability to ensure that their work is made accessible. And there's people like Leslie Chan that have worked on some of that stuff. There's open journal systems. OJS, the open source software project that has as its, or originates here out of Canada to try to provide a platform for many who want to make their work available under OA licenses, and provides them with some of the tools to do that. So I think there has been a lot of thought, and I'm curious as to what the perceived downside is for open access for researchers coming from some of those, from some developing countries.
Can I comment briefly? What I'm saying is that I believe participation is the issue, not access. We operate in massively unequal environments. What we need is participation, the ability to write, to publish your own research from your own perspective for your own country. And this is a power game which developing country governments buy into and developing country academics buy into. But I think we really need to put on the table the question of participation in knowledge production and not just access to other people's knowledge production or into other people's knowledge production systems.
I'm happy to take up part of that, if
Please.
That's appropriate. So I think that's a very valid and valuable insight, although I interpret it as having two potential components. So first of all, with regard to access, I don't know how one does research without accessing the existing set of materials. And so I think having free access to the library of the state-of-the-art in any given scientific discipline is a precondition to participating in that conversation as opposed to some other conversation. And the cost of journal access is simply prohibitive, so that when one is talking without access to what is already written by others, one may be having a conversation that is more valuable than the other one, but one is not participating in that global conversation. So that's on the side of access. The second thing is on the side of what are the components of open access. And I think one of the components of the component of open access that is most publicly visible is the argument about copyright and assertion of copyrights versus Creative Commons or open access journals that don't charge for access. But no less important is the institutional closure and what counts as a valid contribution and what counts as a validator of what counts as a move. I think in this regard, we in academia, particularly in the most powerful institutions and most powerful countries, have a very strong role and charge in stating very clearly the need to open the review process so that anyone can come in. In that regard, if you look at the Public Library of Science, to me, the more interesting component of that is not necessarily PLOS biology, which replicates the traditional peer review model, but makes the outputs open and free, but rather PLOS One, that also tries at least to experiment to some extent with opening up the peer review process so that anyone, in fact, from anywhere can submit materials and make them available on their own basis to be read by others. And that's the beginning, I think, of the organizational and institutional as opposed to the legal and licensing-based component. But I agree that there's a long way to go on that, and that the critical thing is to create a system, both in terms of access to existing information and in terms of openness to receiving information and reading information written elsewhere, that enables, in fact, global participation on questions of global interest and local interest by everyone, not just by people in relatively powerful and wealthy centers able to both buy access and get the respect necessary to be read and heard by others.
We're lucky enough to have, Leslie, do you want to get on this? We have an important proponent of open access here. I'm sure he has some thoughts on this.
I think I know exactly.
Introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry, Leslie Chan from University of Toronto. I also run a project called BioLine International, where we work with a large number of journals from developing countries in an open access basis. So we are seeing participation, but I know where the frustration comes from, where he's coming from, is that there is a tendency of the open access movement, even in the South, to replicate the existing power structure that is still largely controlled by institutions from the North. And more than that, is controlled by a private corporation called Thomson Reuters, who owns the ISI Science Citation Index, which is the global measure of quality of journals. So that even in developing countries, researchers are encouraged or asked to publish in ISI ranked journals, and Eve mentioned IDRC, we have to point that out. And so that this power structures has to be destabilized. And we did, at the beginning, talked about openness as a mean to question these power structures. And so one of the power structure is this evaluation system that is really privately owned, but university all over have outsourced somehow this private company to control this system. So we need to take back that system through some means.
We have another question here.
I was wondering about openness as we transfer this idea to developing countries. It reminds me of the whole climate agenda. Once we have done everything we can in our sphere, we then say we should be open for everybody else. Will openness mean that people in developing countries will not be able to make economic benefit from their intellectual property so that they can also do whatever they want? Because in Canada, we don't think much about it because we pay for it. If we want something, we buy it. What about the intellectual property that might come from the South? Those who can participate, which I agree with, is the main issue, because we're here discussing this, and most people don't understand what we're talking about because they're not involved.
How about it? We've, in the West, been able to benefit and profit from a rigidly enforced intellectual property system that allowed people to make money off of their creations. Now that everybody can contribute, have we revoked the ability to profit?
Actually, you can have quite successful business models based on openness. I would call Macintosh Apple one of the big success stories of open source, because they use BSD and then they have a proprietary layer on top of it. Google is another example of how you can make a lot of money from open source technologies. So that's not really true. Unfortunately, some donor agencies, when they introduce IP, open IP into their grant agreements, then they also introduce non-commercial terms, etc., and that can be dangerous, and that doesn't allow local entrepreneurs to build on the IP using kind of commercial business models. But I completely get your point. If there is a tribal community somewhere in India and they have some traditional healing practice, some herbs that they use, we still insist that they pay royalty on the textbooks that they buy. We still insist that they pay royalty on the films and music that they consume. We still insist that they pay IP royalty on the medicines that they consume, but then we want them to be open about their traditional knowledge. So we have to completely respect that they have a right to be closed and not to share. Many nonprofit attempts at protecting traditional knowledge through prior art databases, hoping that they would later be able to invalidate the patents, that didn't really work, because nonprofits don't have the wet labs that can help them reverse engineer the medicines and then correlate the active ingredient to the traditional medical resource. So you can be completely naive and play straight into the hands of your enemy, but I think increasingly development agencies are thinking about these complicated questions. So it isn't a non-critical blanket advocacy of openness, but rather openness where it is useful. Even, for example, piracy and Ronaldo Limos, it doesn't work the same way across the globe. In India and in Nigeria, we have vibrant film industry thanks to piracy, and in Latin America there is music, but in Tajikistan it doesn't work like that. In Tajikistan, piracy of Indian films, Russian films, and Hollywood films have completely wiped out the Tajik film industry. So it isn't as if either openness or piracy is a silver bullet solution to your developmental problems. It's a complex negotiation, and what openness affords you is some interesting ideas at certain points in history.
Perhaps one final question. Oh, we have more than one, so I think if everyone will stick around with us for a bit.
Hi, Heloise Emden, IDRC. It strikes me that we learned a couple of things from telecoms access, in the sense that asynchronous rates made it possible for greenfields operations like mobile operators to benefit from their newness. So it strikes me that maybe in the intellectual property regime, we should be having asynchronous agreements of payment, that the poor should be paid for access, and the rich should be paying the poor to access them. It is a kind of a relationship that might pan out in the intellectual property regime. A thought. Any comments on that?
Sliding scale, Michael, what do you think?
Well, I think we already have a sliding scale, not one in which we pay necessarily for viewership, but one of the things that we've seen even from say some of the movie studios, for example, is that they'll charge different rates, obviously, for a DVD in this country than they will in China or in some other countries, and that's I think a fairly explicit recognition that both in terms of the market's ability to pay and the reality that there are alternatives, pirate market or other markets, that make this readily accessible at even a lower cost. And so they've got to compete with those markets, and that it's not a one-price-fits-all kind of scenario. So I think we're already there for that. And I also think, and this only builds on what Sunil had to say, that this notion of you're either, if you choose open, you're choosing a non-commercial world, and if you choose closed proprietary IP, you're choosing a commercial world. I mean, to me, that's just quite clearly a false choice. It seems to me that there are many opportunities for commercialization on the open side. And just as the notion that commercial success comes specifically because of an IP system is similarly simply untrue. The notion that we've had some of the successes we've seen specifically because of a copyright law, and this is sort of the old chestnut that, copyright law is good, and so more copyright law must surely be better, I think just is, disproven pretty much on a daily basis.
What about this idea of the developed world subsidizing in some way the access of developing nations? Professor Benkler?
At the moment, we have the opposite, right? So getting away from, right, at the moment what we have is systems, primarily, by the way, driven more by pharmaceuticals than by anything else, of populations whose market pull is not actually focusing, for example, pharmaceutical research on diseases that are generally poor world diseases, paying above marginal cost because of the prohibition on generics, and essentially subsidizing public goods production in wealthier countries. I think it's clear that that's the critical question, is to begin to understand that the marginal contribution of payments globally to actually directing investment in innovation and creativity in wealthier countries is much smaller than the drag on those economies. And the idea of a symmetric application in both directions is essentially one that ends up transferring wealth. Again, unnecessarily, it's not about efficient production from poorer countries to wealthier countries. With regard to subsidies, it's the standard thing you would do through aid, right? If you're talking about aid that's directed at education, that ends up being spent on high-priced books that cover not the marginal cost of the book, but the actual royalties, and the book is from a source that is external to that poor country, then you get subsidies, but essentially the subsidies go back. So you could do that, but I still think that the critical challenge is to recognize that very strong, and here I align both with Sunil and with Michael on this point about open strategies are not non-commercial necessarily, and B, that you can have such a thing, and we do, of excessive IP. And that essentially, given the terms of trade, what you're getting is subsidization of production in wealthier countries of IP goods by people who use those materials in poorer countries. And that stopping that regressive flow is a critical target.
Yes. And then, oh.
Thank you. My name is Adel Zaim. I work with IDRC in Cairo. In fact, I have a question and a comment about openness, access to knowledge, and the demand for access to knowledge. I will take the examples given by Sunil about cricket and the right to watch cricket on TV. You know, recently during the pre-qualification for the Soccer World Cup, Al Jazeera Sport, the TV channel, decided to broadcast the competition only on the paid channel. A lot of people demonstrated. Journalists complained, and really they were complaining against Al Jazeera TV, and even some politicians wrote to Al Jazeera. And they asked them to at least broadcast the competition between or involving Tunisia, Egypt, Algeria, etc. And they accepted. They really broadcasted free-to-air to everybody all around the world. People were happy. There is a law in Egypt about translation of books. Any books can be translated from any language to Arabic after 1 year of its publication if the author or the publisher refused to translate it. So again, it's probably the right to access to knowledge. So if the rationale behind this law is if the author or the publisher is not interested to publish it because of the lack of market, but people need it, so anybody can translate it. But nobody is demonstrating in the streets because they want the book to be translated. You know, even a lot of translators don't even know that that law exists. So there is probably also a problem of how to educate or how to create awareness about this need to access to knowledge and also the possibility to access, the right to access to knowledge. And here my question maybe is about the translation, the role of translation. I was very glad, very happy to hear you, Professor, about the encouraging translation and wishing to see some cultural and linguistics translation in the next future. Do you have any idea about research we can do about the role of translation and the right to access to knowledge in the developing countries?
Sunil.
Since we're talking about translation, I'll tell you the story of Ashwini Bhatt in Gujarat, the same state where all the riots happened. Many people in the audience think that James Bond novels are written by Ian Fleming. But Ian Fleming produced only 7 or 8 James Bond novels. After that, it became a franchisee like Nancy Drew and Enid Blyton, etc. And many other authors were commissioned to produce James Bond novels. And a gentleman called John Gardner from the UK wrote another 7 or 8 James Bond novels, including all the famous ones that we remember, Goldfinger, etc. So the real contribution to James Bond as a brand was not made by Ian Fleming, but by his successor, John Gardner. And John Gardner wrote several such novels in series, where he had one hero which spanned across many novels. And one such series was identified by a Gujarati translator, and this exactly same provision exists in India, that if a publisher or author does not translate their own work, then after a year, anyone, and it's a beautiful business model that you can build your businesses on. There is a marginal royalty that you have to pay, and that royalty is not determined by the author or publisher, but by the copyright registrar in Delhi. So it was a series of 3 novels, and Ashwini Bhatt translated all 3 novels, and they were a raging hit in the Gujarati market. And his audience demanded the 4th novel. But John Gardner did not produce the 4th novel. So Ashwini Bhatt told the Gujarati publisher that I've translated 3 of his novels. I know exactly how he writes. so Ashwini Bhatt wrote the 4th novel. And when it was published, there was the title of the novel, and it said a novel by John Gardner, translated by Ashwini Bhatt. So how do you understand this from an IP perspective? What is the crime? So I think translation and fan fiction, etc., there's a huge cultural space. And you're right, there's a lot of research that can be done here. And some of these stories that will emerge from this research will really challenge the way we look at intellectual property.
I think we did have one last question back here. We'll call it a day.
My name is Niranjan. I'm from Sri Lanka. I'm involved in educating rural youth using ICT. My question and comment is this. Listening to our distinguished panelists and the questions, I thought this whole conference was revolving around intellectual property, privacy, confidentiality, and democracy-like things. But I think in terms of open development, of course, there are about 90% of my people in my country are using mobile phones, and about 15% have access to internet on their own or shared access through telecenters. I'm talking about those who don't have this, who are not using internet, who don't have access to internet, who don't use phones, like farmers, women, rural, youth who don't have jobs, and people are in cultural conflicts like post-war issues like we have in Sri Lanka. So language issues. So how do you take open development, relate technology to make them participate them in the global development or global world, global space? So this is the people who are excluded, who don't have access to internet or phones. But still they use computers, they have some form of access, but how? So I think I would like to ask how this gap could be filled.
We used to talk more about the digital divide, and perhaps now we assume that this is a solved problem. Is it?
I think that there is a need also in terms of looking at research as well as public financing models, of not just looking at digital public goods, but also at digital platforms. Why I say that is, when we critique, and as we did about 2 hours ago, we started talking about power relations, and we talked really about, private platforms which have become public spaces, like social networking sites and, email and all that. We were really talking about how these are just club goods. In some sense, you have access, but, it excludes. Now, if you're really going to look at the inclusion of the marginalized people at the periphery, for whom, institutional change can be maximally beneficial, then you actually have to create public platforms. And, we often talk about, creating commons for content that's produced by public institutions, where with public money, you have maybe audiovisual material that's produced in the name of development. Where are these archives? So how do you archive these? Where do you put these? And that should be in the public domain. And these are I think there's a need also for local governments, national governments to understand that it's not just products, information products, but how do you deal with information flows? How do you actually provide for public platforms which can accommodate changes in the way in which communications and information gets transacted? And based on that, Niranjan, your question about, how do you actually bring information closer, and how do you then address the questions of the poor and the marginalized will depend on the kind of policies and the kind of public policy measures that get taken to construct these public platforms, digital public platforms.
Any last thoughts on this? All right, well, one last round of applause, please, for our panel.